All right, so briefly, my name is Rob Rudin. I'm a solutions architect with MarkLogic and been with the company for just over 2 years. I was a customer for 5 years prior to that. So maybe like some of you in the room, when I first started working with MarkLogic 7 years ago, very skeptical. I had a very traditional Java, Oracle, Sybase, SQL Server background. It's like, what in the world is this? Why are we using it? Things went well, joined the company, and here I am. So the demo I'm going to be showing today is available on my GitHub account. There's a lot of other goodies there, so you can feel free to try the demo out, impress your friends afterwards. All right, so big picture, we've been talking a lot about the operational data hub, the idea of having this flexible, scalable database in the middle, MarkLogic. We have all these other systems connected to it. We can bring all types of data into MarkLogic from these other systems. And this is something I saw firsthand as a customer. We can have this one place where we can do both analytics and operations, heavy transactional workload, and still have a heavy search and analytics workload. But the challenge is, how do we keep these things all in sync? It's not like we just bring MarkLogic in and get rid of everything else, right? We've got all these other systems we need to keep around, and we need to keep them in sync with MarkLogic. And that's where EAI comes in. And I want to give a real-world example. This is when I was a customer. And we came into an environment where there's a lot of different systems in place. There's JMS message queues sitting on an enterprise service bus. So, kind of a common pattern for an organization. All the data coming in would be on a queue, and then it would get farmed out to other systems. MarkLogic would become one of those. There's, of course, many relational databases. Some of them were being replaced by MarkLogic, but others were going to stick around, and we needed to stay in sync with them. There's web services, both that we needed to invoke to get data, and also ones that we had invoked to send data to. There was exports that we had to do to different BI tools, and some of those exports were just, here's a dump of all our data, take it, have fun with it. We even had enterprise Java Bean interfaces. They were still around. I thought that wasn't the case, but we did have EJB clients that we needed to talk with as well. And so we brought MarkLogic into the middle with all these different systems, and the question was, well, how's this all going to work together? And that's the kind of problem that EAI solves. If you remember back to the 90s where we had protocols like Corba for integrating systems together, and then in the mid-2000s, SOA, kind of like the cloud or cyber of today, you had to be doing SOA. It was a pattern for trying to integrate different systems together. You started to see enterprise service buses. Oftentimes those big vendors that had app servers, and then they would make an ESB, based on their app server. And all these things were trying to do the same thing, which is integrating these systems together that we need for running the business. Again, if you bring MarkLogic in, you still have all these other systems, and we need to have them integrated together nicely. And one thing I wanted to distinguish, too, is EAI versus ETL. I actually have a separate presentation, which you can catch tomorrow morning. 10:15, and that discusses more ETL, and I wanted to just differentiate between the two because I think there can be some confusion. EAI is typically a lot of messages, so frequent occurrence, and again, messages, so showing up on a queue or on a file system or pulling from some service interface, and there's often many steps. So you might have some content-based routing. You get a message, you broadcast it out to different channels. They each do different things on it. And then there's many different systems involved. So not just databases, but web services, FTP servers, all kinds of different things. ETL, a little bit different. It's usually much less frequent. It might just be once, right? You might just do one big ETL job to get data out of, for example, a relational database and then put it in MarkLogic. And it tends to be batch-oriented. We're taking much, much larger amounts of data and moving it around. And we typically have well-defined steps: extract, transform, load. We're probably all familiar with that. The transformation might be pretty complicated, but again, it's usually those 3 steps. And then typically, it's database to database. Not always, but typically. Whereas EAI, again, we have lots of different interfaces that we're going to stitch together. All right, so reframing the problem, we want to build this operational data hub. We've got all these other systems that we need to keep in sync. We've got data feeds, data transformation, and usually a concept of entity resolution. There's been a lot of talk of entities during MarkLogic World so far. The idea is when I get data from one system, how do I know if I already got data like it in my existing system? Maybe I want to merge those records together. And how do I do that? And so how is EAI going to help us with it? And more importantly, how are EAI and MarkLogic going to work together? So what I'm hopefully going to convince you of is your EAI solution can actually be better with MarkLogic. There's a lot of that MarkLogic brings to the table that can make EAI a simpler problem to solve. So we want to understand what can MarkLogic do, what can EAI, I think I've said that correctly most of this presentation so far, what can EAI tools do as well, and then what are recommendations for blending the two together. All right, so we need to understand that MarkLogic, it is a database, but it's much more than just a database. There's this powerful search engine built in. There's a very powerful layer of application services built in. And in our traditional approach with EAI, we're normally doing everything in middleware, right? Before I mentioned how in the mid-2000s, when we were talking about SOA, you started to see these big ESBs that would do everything for us. It's a little bit different with MarkLogic. Again, there's all these features built into MarkLogic beyond just the database that we're going to want to leverage when we're doing this integration work. So we're going to see a lot of sequence diagrams. I like sequence diagrams. I encourage you to use them as well. And this is what traditional EAI normally looks like. We've got some data set, maybe a database, maybe an FTP server, something over on the left. We have an EAI engine in the middle. That's that cog. And it's doing everything. It's probably trying to get data into a relational database. So it's going to extract the data, transform it, clean it up, massage it. And then it's going to say, OK, it's going to do entity resolution. Do I have data in my relational database that looks like this? If so, I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to merge it together. And then I'm going to maybe do many inserts, updates, and deletes. And in order to do that, I've got a model up front, right? I need to understand how I'm actually going to put this into my relational database. And I have to deal with things like if I don't have non-tabular content, where's it going to go? Clobs, blobs, somewhere else, maybe on the file system. So maybe if you've built systems like this before, I certainly had prior to MarkLogic. But with MarkLogic, there's a lot of these capabilities we can actually do within the database. And this is one approach, and we're going to, again, see multiple sequence diagrams showing different architectures. But one approach you can certainly consider is I'm still going to have an EAI tool that's going to do data extraction. But then maybe I take that data, and MarkLogic, again, it's really a big HTTP box from an integration perspective. So it's very easy to talk to. I'm going to send data to MarkLogic. It could be XML, JSON, binaries, anything. And then within MarkLogic, there's a lot I can do with that data. I can do transformation on it. I can do entity resolution. I can use MarkLogic search capabilities to query for matching records. And then no matter what kind of data I have, I can do many inserts, updates, and deletes all in one transaction very easily. And MarkLogic also has the capability via triggers. I can do a lot of post-processing as well. Something called content processing framework that allows me to have ingestion pipelines and essentially do anything that I want to post-process that data. And some of the benefits, I can store anything, and I don't need a bundle up front. So I can take a very iterative approach to this. So, just to go over some of those features in terms of how MarkLogic facilitates EAI. Again, we can store any data. You don't have to worry about how am I going to fit something in there. The REST API is often a very easy way to get started with getting data in. If you're not familiar with it, the first time you work with MarkLogic, you're most likely going to want to set up a REST API server. It gives you a number of endpoints that allow you to do a number of very powerful and common things that you'll want to do. And in terms of EAI, it gives us an easy way to get documents in and also apply transforms. Again, triggers, a way to add post-processing after we've loaded the data. Indexes allow us to resolve entities. And we always have the ability to do essentially any server-side programming we want. XQuery, JavaScript. We could call other services, send emails, anything that we need to do. But something important to remember is MarkLogic itself it's not an EAI tool. We don't want to get rid of an EAI tool that we may have used before. There's still that need to extract from a wide variety of data sources. MarkLogic can talk HTTP very well, but if you need to pull from a relational database, from a JMS queue, from an FTP server, pick any protocol that you want. EAI tools are generally going to support a much wider variety of data sources and protocols. External services, and this is something we'll get into in quite a bit of detail in the demos. There's normally a lot of other systems and services we'll need to talk to as part of an EAI. There may be libraries. I mentioned before when I was a customer, we had an EJB interface we had to talk to. And sure enough, there's a library that we could use to talk to it. Your organization may have libraries built up that allow you to talk to different systems within your organization, and you want to make use of those. And they may be written in a language, or they may be an executable that you can't really reuse within MarkLogic. And then content routing. It's very common to get a message and say, OK, if it looks like this, I'm going to shoot it over here and do these 5 things. Or if it looks like that, I'm going to go over here and do these 3 things. EAI tools give you a way to orchestrate all of that work. So MarkLogic, obviously a great product. We all love it. It can do a tremendous number of things for us, all tightly integrated together. But it's not an EAI tool. You could probably build one if given enough time and money. But most of the time, you're going to want to use one that already exists. And there's probably one in your organization that's being used already. All right, so recommendations for EAI. We're going to go through 3 different use cases here, 3 different demos. The first one is going to be a simple hot folder. Files show up, we put them in MarkLogic. Nothing to it. Second one is going to be a hot folder that depends on an external service, where we're going to call it, it's going to do some processing for us, and we'll throw the results in MarkLogic. I'm using a hot folder. You can think of a hot folder as similar to anything where data arrives on a periodic basis. So JMSQ, it's all the same. It's just easier for me to set this up. And then finally, we'll look at a fairly complicated ingestion pipeline where we have entity resolution and some complex transformation rules. And we're going to use Apache Camel as our EAI tool. There's many EAI tools out there, commercial, open source. I've used a number of commercial ones. One of the main differences you'll see between commercial and open source is commercial ones typically will have some sort of a GUI that allows you to draw a lot of pretty boxes and arrows for where your data is going to go and how it's going to be transformed and managed. Open source ones typically don't have that, but Camel is certainly a good one I've used on a number of projects and good for the demo here. A little bit more about Camel. It is an open source integration framework. It's modeled after what is both a book and a set of concepts called Enterprise Integration Patterns. Very good book to read if you're interested in more information on this subject. It's written in Java, which is good in terms of there's many popular Java projects out there. It integrates with just about any protocol that you can think of. And it's been around for a while, almost 10 years now, so fairly mature as far as open source technologies go. We're next going to walk through each one of these components on this slide here. This just gives you a sense of how broad the ecosystem is. And this isn't just Camel. You're going to see this for most EAI tools. This is part of how they deliver value, is providing a lot of out-of-the-box components to talk to just about anything that you can think of. I do want to go through some of the components that we're going to use today, though. First one is the file component. Again, this allows us to watch a directory. Anytime a file shows up, you can do something with it. There's an HTTP component, which is very handy for talking with the MarkLogic REST API. This is the simplest way to essentially integrate Camel with MarkLogic together. There's a bean component, which allows you to write any custom Java code that you want. This is a very good story for MarkLogic. A lot of the tools that we provide outside of the core MarkLogic product are Java libraries. Hence, it's very easy to integrate them in to Camel. And there's also a broadcast component that we're going to make use of. This allows us to take a message and shoot it off in multiple directions and do different kinds of processing on it. And then there's dozens more. Again, just about anything that you can think of, and you can always write your own as well. All right, so we're going to get going with the first demo here. Again, simple hot folder. So you can imagine, I think there's still a lot of integration that happens this way today, which is files show up and then they're ingested by another system. And so in this case, imagine we've got applications writing files to some directory, and as soon as they show up, we just simply want to load them into MarkLogic. And Camel makes watching a directory easy. We have that file component, but how do we actually get the file into MarkLogic? So we could do, I meant to animate this one. Well, ignore the bottom half. We could do everything in Camel first. There's a way to, for example, if we have zip files coming in, we can unzip them with Camel. If it's a huge XML file, we can break it apart. We can do transformation. We could then use the MarkLogic REST API to do a simple put to the v1 documents endpoint, and we can set collections and permissions. We need a way to determine the URI, but that's not too hard to do. So we really could do just about everything in Camel and then just make simple use of the REST API. But generally anytime you have data on disk, I highly recommend looking at Content Pump first. This is where our MarkLogic Content Pump tool really excels. All those things I just mentioned that we can do with Camel, all of those are already baked into Content Pump in terms of transforming data, splitting up XML files, splitting up zips. These are all things we've been doing for many years now with Content Pump. So even though this is a simple example, it's a good one in terms of our EAI tool, Camel, is going to handle the extraction part, right? Watching a directory, and then we're going to use Content Pump and MarkLogic for loading and indexing the data. And again, sequence diagram. So very simple, watch the file system. Camel invokes MLCP with whatever options that we want, insert into MarkLogic. And though I don't have it in the demo, of course, you can always slap a transform and triggers on to the end for any sort of processing you need. And again, I mentioned Camel can be extended via custom components. This is a case where, since Content Pump is a Java library, very easy to integrate into Camel. And now I'm going to start flipping between my IntelliJ IDE and then Chrome to show you a web application, and we'll load some data up. So first, and again, this is available right now. It doesn't have instructions yet, but it will, and then you can try it out. So this is an application that I used one of our slush generators to create. If you're not familiar with the slush generators, you can pretty much Google on MarkLogic slush and you'll find them. These are tools that came out of our demo team. They're extremely handy. If you remember App Builder from earlier versions of MarkLogic, App Builder allowed you to quickly crank out a new search application, but it's a little bit hard to extend. The slush generators crank out an Angular MarkLogic application that's designed for extensibility. So very, very good way for putting together demonstrations where you need to do a search. And right now we don't have any data. We do have a map. That's a little hint of what's coming up next. So no data, and I'm going to go to IntelliJ here and run my Camel program. And I won't spend a lot of detail on this, but this is the Camel configuration here. And again, just simple. I'm going to look at that inbox MLCP directory, and then any file that shows up, I'm going to use Content Pump to load it up. So let me start up Camel here. Wait till it's ready. Okay, and hide those. I don't want to give away what's coming up. And so I'm going to take this first file. First, I'm going to take a PDF, just drag it over to this MLCP directory that Camel is watching, and then you can see the logging on the bottom. Camel sees the file. We call Content Pump, and as you would expect, if I do a search over here, the PDF is now in my database. I just put a simple collection on it, so it'd be easy to find. I can click on this and click download, just a demonstration of I can easily put a PDF into MarkLogic and then get it out easily. And just very quickly, I'm going to take these 3 other XML files, drop them all in there at once, and Camel's going to chew through them. And then we'll do a search again. And you can see, just as you expect, we have 4 documents, a couple Camel configuration files, and a logback XML file. Right? So very simple so far. We'll go back to the presentation. Main recommendation from this is if you have data on a file system, use Content Pump to load it. It's going to be your easiest way to get data in. And you can see if you do, for this sort of integration, almost trivial to do it with an EAI tool in MarkLogic. All right, so we're going to make it a little bit more interesting. We're going to incorporate an external service next. And what we're going to do for this one is use a file format called a shapefile. This is something produced by ESRI. It's a geospatial data format, and it's a zip file that has a lot of different things in it. And what we want to do here is collect these shape files and then bounce them against an external service called Ogre that's on the internet, and that's going to spit out GeoJSON data. We're then going to take both the original shapefile and the GeoJSON, toss them into MarkLogic, and then search them. And so via this very simple integration, we're going to have a nice searchable shapefile repository with the original shapefiles in MarkLogic. So before I go through the demonstration, some of the options that we would consider for this integration is we could invoke Ogre because it's an HTTP service. We could invoke it very easily from MarkLogic. MarkLogic can talk HTTP very easily. But there is a command line client as well. And so this is something we have to consider in terms of where do we actually want to put the call to an external service. And a couple things that I consider when I'm looking at this decision. One is testability. When I started using MarkLogic, we had a team of about 50 engineers, and a lot of us had traditional Java backgrounds. We started working with MarkLogic, and we really liked it a lot. And we said, hey, let's do everything in MarkLogic. And that included starting to make HTTP calls to other services. But if you do a lot of test-driven development or just automated testing in general, you're probably familiar with when you have dependencies on external systems, it's nice if you can mock those interfaces and write your own test to make sure that your system responds correctly when you get data back from that external service. From experience, I can tell you that's a little bit more difficult to do if you're calling the external service in MarkLogic. We actually did that and involved some gymnastics that I think weren't really worth it. My experience has been if you have external services to call, I like to do that from middleware, from an EAI tool. I think there's a number of benefits to doing that one of which is for easier testability. And then in this case, there's also the availability concern. If we wanted to support clients where we don't have, if we're in disconnected operations, but we have the command line tool, we could have a library that could both talk to that web service when it's available and invoke the command line. And so that's something we could package up as a little library and use it in our EAI tool. So what we're going to see here is file system on the left. So again, we've got that hot folder. I'm going to drop some shape files into it. Camel's going to make a call to Ogre, get GeoJSON back, and then it's going to hand off the shapefile and the GeoJSON to MarkLogic. Again, we always have that option for, and I apologize, we actually do have a transform in this case as well so that we can put a single point on the GeoJSON to make it searchable on our map. Okay, so this is another example where we could make a custom Camel component. Again, whatever EAI tool you're using, maybe we'd want to make a custom component that allows us to use both the web and command line versions. Okay, so let me go through that demonstration next. And so I've got Camel running. I'm going to open up my shapefiles directory. And these are all shapefiles that you can actually download off the internet as well. They're just administrative regions within different countries. If you're familiar with the abbreviations, I picked very small countries because they're faster to demonstrate, and we don't have to wait for them. But I'm going to be adventurous and dump them all into this shapefiles directory here. And then Camel's just going to go to work on them one at a time. I do have Camel configured to work sequentially here. It's single threaded. It's just going to go one at a time. It's very straightforward to configure it to be to run in parallel. So it do all files all at the same time via multiple threads. And so this is good. The internet connection's working. Camel's making calls to the Ogre service. And I'm going to go over here and do a refresh. We'll see how many of them we have so far. Okay, so up to, we got 5 of the shapefiles and 4 GeoJSON. And we're going to start seeing some data appear up on the map here. Let's do one more refresh, and hopefully we've got all 8 of them. Yeah, 6, pretty good. So still 2 left to go, but I'll go and dive down into some of these files for you. Yeah, they're all starting to show up. And if I just go into my search results, you can see here's the original shapefile. It's a zip file that's in MarkLogic. I'm going to dive down into, let's do Switzerland here, and show you what the GeoJSON looks like. And in this case, I did write a very small transform. If I click on XML and give you the full view of the data, you can see that the way we get this data back, there's a lot of different features with all kinds of interesting metadata. You can probably imagine there's a number of facets that we'd want to set up on these. Some of the elements are really good candidates for range indexes. And all I did was write a simple transform that took the first point that showed up in all of these different polygons and then added it at the top of the document here. And I've got a geospatial index on it. That's why it's showing up on the map. And there we go. You've got all 8 of them now. Okay, so go back to the presentation. So in general, I recommend when you have external services involved with EAI, invoke them from your EAI tool. Let your EAI tool handle that burden, and then take the results and hand everything off to MarkLogic for additional transformation and indexing. All right, so the final demo we're going to go through here is a more complicated ingestion pipeline. In this case, we're going to be looking at another publicly available data set. This is called the GDL event database. And the notion behind this is every 15 minutes, there's a new events file that's available that has news events in them, and it's done some basic entity extraction so that there's persons, organizations, locations, themes, actor codes, things like that. It's actually a very interesting data set. It's very good to put into MarkLogic because of the structured data. We've got some unstructured data and some geospatial data as well. But this is not a simple data format. There's a 7-page cookbook for the particular data format that we're using. There's actually another data format that they have that's even more complicated. So there's a lot of different things, a lot of different transformation rules that we're going to have to apply as part of ingesting this data. So some of the challenges that we have, again, we have an external service. We actually need to make 2 calls to it. One call is to say, okay, what's the new batch of events? What's the URL for it? And then the second call is going to be to download that batch. In most of these batches of events, there's often multiple lines per source URL, where the source URL is a web page that describes the news event. I'm not sure why that is. That's just how the data set is. That's often the case. We get data sets and we're not sure why they're the way they are, but that's how they are. We have to deal with it. In this case, I'd really like to consolidate all those different lines into one document. I don't want to have many documents that are almost the same with the same source URL except for a couple elements. So this is going to be an example of doing entity resolution. And I may have seen that URL in a previous batch as well. Same thing. I don't want to create a bunch of duplicate documents with the same source URL. I want to query MarkLogic to see if the data is already there. So one way that we can do this with Camel and MarkLogic is we can have Camel do the event-based part where every 15 minutes it calls out to get the new URLs and then it downloads the event files. It then does all the merging of rows that have the same source URL, massages the data, does whatever we need to, and then it calls MarkLogic with an XML or JSON document. And MarkLogic on a transform can then do a merge if there's already a document in there. But this is also something that we could do entirely within MarkLogic as well. MarkLogic has the notion of a scheduled task. We could easily set that up to run every 15 minutes to get the URLs and do the download and then do all the work completely within MarkLogic. And it'd be a fairly simple thing, all the merging, searching for existing documents, et cetera. So what I'm going to show you here is what I found to be a good blend of Camel and MarkLogic, and why we're actually going to do a little bit more of the work in Camel as opposed to MarkLogic. For one thing, Camel and most EAI tools are going to have really good support for very large payloads and splitting them up and parallelizing the work. And often that might be something that you want to have the burden of that work being done, for example, on a separate VM where you have Camel running, as opposed to MarkLogic having to do all of that work itself. There are solutions within MarkLogic for parallelizing out a lot of different work into different threads. There's one called TaskBot that I've used on a couple projects. But in general, I think this is something that I start with having my EAI tool do. And another benefit here is because we have an external service, we can mock it very easily for testing purposes. And that's often very important when we have very complex data coming from an external service. In a test-driven development approach, we're going to want to write a lot of tests to make sure we're handling the data correctly. Thus, we want to be able to mock that external service. And when we have this kind of complex logic, this is when we really need to consider the personnel that we have. Who are the developers on our team? If we're going to be writing hundreds of lines of code to rip apart this data based on some very complicated cookbook, they may not be ready to do that in something like xQuery or server-side JavaScript yet. They may want to write C# or Java or Ruby code, whatever they're comfortable with. So we definitely need to account for our personnel when we're having to write significant chunks of code here as part of our EAI flow. So in general, recommendations. I forgot the demo. There we go. All right, so let's switch over. And I need to restart Camel here because the way I have this flow configured, it's something that runs on startup. So let me just change a Boolean from false to true. And then I will kick this off. And what Camel is going to do when it starts up is make that call to GDL. It's going to download a zip file, and then just to make sure something was happening, every time it processes one of the rows within the zip file, it's just logging a message of done. And there's also a transform within MarkLogic that's taking every row that comes in to say, have I already seen the source URL before? If so, I'm going to merge it together with the document that I've already created. And we normally get a few thousand events per zip file. So there we go, all done. And if we do a search, we're going to have a lot of interesting data here. Our map is going to explode with different hits. And we had 532 documents. Again, that's after merging all the duplicate source URLs together. And you can see this really good data set. We have data from all over the world here. Again, good example of some of MarkLogic's indexing capabilities. I can limit my results to just what's shown on the map here. And if I open one of these up, sorry, Mark, did you want a picture there? OK, afterwards. Let me see. I haven't seen this data before because it just came out in the past 15 minutes. Let me cross my fingers. There we go. And here's an example of one where we had the same source URL. And you can see there's a number of different actor 1 and actor 2 types. And what my transform did is anytime it got another event with the same source URL, it just added that global event ID from that row. And anytime the actor codes were different, it copied those over as well. Very simple transform, not saying that's the best one to do here, but I just wanted to show an example of how to do entity resolution and then merging documents together. And if I go back over the search interface there, you can also see we have these nice facets over here. Again, very good data set for demoing MarkLogic's capabilities. All right, and now I'll go to the next slide with some recommendations for complex ingest. So in general, I would look at having the EAI tool handle large payloads. A number of other benefits you're normally going to see from an EAI tool is, again, there's content-based routing. You may get a zip file with many different kinds of files in it, or you may have a very large XML file with very different kinds of sub-elements, and you want to send them each to a different flow based on the content of each file or each XML element. There is the ability to split things up and then aggregate things back together within EAI tools. Again, given enough time, you could code all of that in MarkLogic, but most EAI tools are going to make that a simple matter of configuration, as is the case with Camel. Always consider the need for mocking external services for testing purposes. Absolutely consider your personnel as well. What are they going to be comfortable writing a lot of complex, potentially complex integration code in? All right, and a summary of the demonstrations that we saw. So simple hot folder. Anytime you've got data on disk, use content pump to get into MarkLogic. It's going to be most likely the simplest way to get that done. When you have data on disk, but you need to invoke an external service, or anytime you have an external service, I would consider invoking that from your EAI tool for the reasons I've mentioned. And when you have a complex ingestion, let your EAI tool handle that large payload, particularly if your personnel are going to be more comfortable writing complex integration code within their EAI tool. If you split the payload up in MarkLogic, you're kind of forcing your personnel to do the coding work within MarkLogic as well. Okay, so summary. We want to build these operational data hubs. We know if we bring MarkLogic into the middle, we're going to have many different systems that we still need to integrate with. Hopefully you understand a little bit more about what MarkLogic can do as part of an EAI approach, and also understand what EAI tools are generally going to do for you. And as I mentioned before in other presentations, get and follow recommendations. MarkLogic consulting services, if you have consultants on site with you, definitely bounce ideas off of them before you get started. MarkLogic training, which is free to you, is going to help you with some of the skills for really leveraging what MarkLogic can do. And there's always Stack Overflow as well. Put a question up there, talk about the data you're trying to bring together, tag it with MarkLogic. There's many of us that watch questions there, and we'll be more than happy to give you answers for your EAI challenges. And that's all I've got. So I'll open it up for a QA. So if you've got any questions, I don't think we have a microphone to just raise your hand. I'll call on you for a question. Or we do have a microphone.
Testing. Oh, here we go.
Hello. How can you propagate transactions so that if you need to roll back, when you have rollback from MarkLogic, you get propagated so the other previous transaction in EAI get rolled back as well?
Right. So I think an example of that, and I didn't do it for this demonstration. If let's say we had wanted to ingest the GeoJSON file and the shapefile together, which I actually didn't do. I had content pump load the shapefile right away, and then I used the Java client API. If you wanted, in this case, if I wanted to do both the shapefile and the GeoJSON document together, I could have used our Java client API to open up a transaction and write both documents. And if anything fails, the transaction will roll back and nothing will be persisted to MarkLogic. So if you're looking for those kind of transaction semantics, I would definitely start with one of our client APIs, either the Java API or the Node API, or you can do it directly from the HTTP interface. And then you can let your EAI tool decide whatever you want to do if a transaction fails. Most of them have some sort of error handling support. Everybody's convinced this is easy to do. MarkLogic is the answer. There'd be no reason to try to put the data anywhere else. No.
This may not be a question actually for here, but if you could go back to the last slides where you have this operational data, right? What would be the rationale for putting HR data, say, along with some other data? It's more of how do we make the case for creating this operational database? You have HR, finance, they don't relate to each other.
Sure. Let me give you an answer, and there might be some other folks that want to, because I think a lot of the focus of our conference is to build that case for you of why you'd want to bring data sets from different silos into one place. Just a quick example from my experience as a customer, the databases I built initially were tracking people. So we're getting information about people from many different places. And I think that's a little bit similar to systems that you're going to see within an organization. Your HR system will have some information about a person. You may have another database that has other information about an employee. And in that case, if I want to do queries against all the data I know about a particular person, it'd be nice if I could have it all in one database together. So maybe I would get a row from my employees table in my HR database and a row from an employees table in my finance database or my CRM or ERP, and then take those two rows, create two documents in MarkLogic, and either link them together with a triple or maybe merge them together into one document. So it's really, I mean, that's definitely a big question. And again, a lot of what we're trying to do is make the case for that, but it's all in the name of data integration and being able to have that, albeit a cliche, have that 360 view of the entities that you care about within your organization. And Frank, if you want to jump in. Yeah.
So generally what we see in that regard is you want to look for a business pain that necessitates it, right? You don't build technology for technology's sake. You don't just set up a data hub and then say, come, consume the data, right? You look at a business need that says, there are 2 data sources I need to integrate, or 3 or 4, and build and solve that problem. And then as you continue to layer on, you may add additional data sources, right? So rather than set up a separate silo that integrates 3 different data sources, you then just look at adding those 3 data sources to the 4 you've already integrated, right? So you're providing stepwise incremental value to the business at every step, because otherwise it's a 3-year effort or a 5-year effort, and frequently those projects fail because by the time they're finished, they're out of date. So you have to be delivering value the entire way along and then promoting it internally so that people know the resources there and can start to use and consume it.
And one note to follow on with that too, one of the customers I'm supporting, we're building a criminal history database, so they're starting to bring data from multiple places into MarkLogic. And then they've already realized, hey, if we've got criminal history data here, maybe there's this other offender registry data that we want to bring in and have consolidated pictures of people that have committed particular offenses. They've talked about bringing archive services into MarkLogic as well. They're still going to have their EAI tool, which for them is a service bus from a particular large red company. But that's still a good pattern because they're using that ESB to mediate all access to MarkLogic. The key for us is we're able to bring all the data into one place, and then that ESB can serve kind of like as a facade for all clients to be able to get at their data. So even once you've got a lot of data into MarkLogic, I still think there's a lot of value of having some sort of EAI solution.
My question is twofold. So first, how do you get data out of relational databases? Do you use triggers? Do you poll
10:15 tomorrow morning. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thereabouts, I think that's.
Okay, so you will also answer the question.
I'll give you an answer for that, though. But go ahead with your second question.
And the second one, how do you cope with tables that you want to join together to put them into
10:15
one
tomorrow morning.
document?
Yeah. So very briefly, yeah, I did this presentation yesterday. We're doing a repeat of it tomorrow. So there'll be at least one person at the repeat, which is good. Very briefly, the presentation focuses on what are the different techniques for taking tables and either copying them as is, or what's much more common, merging sets of tables together into these integrated documents that are, again, are very entity-driven, entity-based. So you'll see, we'll go into a full 40 minutes of detail on that, which isn't really nearly enough, but we'll at least get a good flavor for it.
So in your examples with the 3 different kinds of data, you said with a hot folder, you recommended to use MLCP, whereas if you had a complex ingestion, it would be put that on EAI. Now, what if you had a mix of 2 or all 3 of those? Would it be better to split those up for any reason, or would it be best to just keep the separation of concerns and go with the EAI on that? Yeah,
I'll give you a somewhat Camel-specific answer here, and again, this is where. I don't want to get into Camel configuration so much here, but this idea of a multicast and doing parallel processing, this is an example where I can take a message, shoot it off to different places, and I can also do that based on the content. So for example, if I have a hot folder, I might want to set up different content-based routing rules based on the extension of the file. If it's a zip file, I'm going to send it over here, and then maybe I'll use content pump for ingesting that. If it's a .json file, I'll send it over here, maybe do some processing, and then call content pump. I think that's generally going to be answered by your EAI tool, but in general, either content pump or the REST API are going to give you the interfaces you need for getting data in. And I should mention as well, you all heard at the keynote this morning, the data movement SDK. There you go, Sam. That's $5. You heard about the DM SDK. One of the benefits of that is going to be giving us a very powerful write interface for getting data into MarkLogic that gives us a lot of the benefits that we have with Content Pump, but it won't have the restriction of loading data only from disk. But you'll still, in my opinion, you'll still want some sort of EAI tool for orchestrating the entire process. And we at MarkLogic will keep providing better and better tools to make it easier and easier to get data in just the way you want it with as little as effort as possible.
So you think with that, it would just kind of the workflow?
Yes, yeah. Until we are, in fact, providing an EAI tool. And then this is OBE, right? Yeah, MarkLogic 10. Yeah. That's off the record. Yeah. Actually, I've been hoping for Lisp in MarkLogic 10. So XQuery, JavaScript, we're all moving to Lisp, right? Data and code in one language. Go ahead.
Are you familiar with Apache Kafka, and how would you compare and contrast the use of the case of that for against like Camel?
Right. So I'm familiar with, I'm a programmer, so I'm always afraid to talk about something I don't have hands-on experience with. I don't have hands-on experience with Kafka. My understanding is it is a messaging queue. So my guess would be it's similar to a JMS queue in that I'm going to have some sort of subscription capability via my EAI tool. And in fact, I'm 99.9% sure if I just type in Camel Kafka here, I'll come up with the Camel component page. Whoa, hold on. Avert. Yeah, I need Chris Atkinson's time travel capability there. Yeah, so this, and I think you'll find this with other EI tools. You can, for Camel, you can generally Google Camel, name a thing, and you're going to get the page for documentation on it. So my guess would be it's a simple matter of pointing at a Kafka queue, and then Camel will get the data as a message, and then you figure out what you'd like to do with it. Yeah. All right. And